That is much hard work. And you could maybe die before your time.
I feel all right. You feel all right? Oh, wonderful.
Hello, this is Mike Bell with another little video for the Wild West History Association, and today I'd like to discuss this man, Kid Curry. One of the most notorious outlaws in the history of the West and associate of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid and others. Kid Curry is probably best known to the general public for being portrayed by actor Ted Cassidy in the film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid back in 1969. Cassidy was best known for portraying Lurch, the butler in the Addams Family TV series. But in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, he plays the outlaw Harvey Logan. And there is a famous scene, popularly known as the Rules What Rules scene, in which Kid Curry challenges Butch Cassidy for the leadership of the gang. Cassidy, played by Paul Newman, asks Kid Curry what the rules are. Kid Curry, who's brandishing a very large Bowie knife, looks perplexed and says, "Rules? What rules?" At which point, after a bit of interplay, Paul Newman kicks Curry in the sweetbreads. Kid Curry collapses, and that's the end of the non-fight. Then there's the 1970s TV series Alias, Smith and Jones, in which Kid Curry is portrayed by Ben Murphy. Now, that TV series took the bantering buddy formula that had worked so well in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid between those two outlaws and transferred it to the TV series, in which the two outlaws were Hannibal Hayes, who didn't exist, and Kid Curry, who did exist. But Ben Murphy's Kid Curry bears only the most passing of resemblances to the real man. Other than the name, there is nothing that crosses over between the real outlaw and the Ben Murphy character. And some may know Kid Curry from the works of historians such as James David Horan, who in his early work portrayed Kid Curry as the tiger of the Wild Bunch and a pathological killer. Now, Curry did indeed lead what became known as the Wild Bunch, and he was a killer. But whether he deserves that level of reputation is a moot point, which we'll examine as we go through this little talk. So who was Kid Curry? Well, Kid Curry was born Harvey Alexander Logan in 1867 in Richland Township, Tamar County, Iowa, according to census records. He was the son of William and Eliza Jane Logan. And he had 4 brothers and a sister. James was the oldest brother, then came Henry, known as Hank, then Harvey himself, then sister Allie, then Johnny Logan, and finally the youngest of all, Lorenzo Dow Logan, known to his brothers in the world as Lonnie Logan. William and James Logan disappear from the lives of their children and their brothers pretty early on, as does Eliza Jane Logan. It's possible she died in childbirth, but we don't really know much about what happened to the Logan's parents and their older brother. By about 1880, the remaining Logan children can be found in Dodson, Missouri, what was then a little township south of Kansas City, now long since absorbed into the Kansas City sprawl. They were living with William and Elizabeth Lee, their uncle and aunt, Elizabeth being the sister of Harvey Logan's father, William. Sometime in the mid-1880s, the Logan boys left home, as did so many young men at the time, and headed west. Evidence of what they did in the next few years is a bit thin, but they reappeared in the late 80s, early 90s in the mining town of Landusky, Montana, which is about 150 miles east of Fort Benton, not far from the Milk River, and sits in the Little Rockies. The Logan boys may have travelled through Texas and Wyoming. They may have worked on ranches there and driven cattle north, but that whole area of their lives needs much more research. By the time they arrived in Montana, however, they were calling themselves the Curry Brothers. Now, legend will tell you that they took the name Curry from this man. This is outlaw Flatnose George Curry, a Wyoming outlaw. The problem with the legend is that Flatnose George was much younger than the Logan brothers, and he didn't really get into outlawry until the mid-1890s in the aftermath of the Johnson County War of 1892. In fact, Flatnose George spent a lot of time hanging around the town of Sundance, Wyoming, where he worked on ranches and rustled cattle. And indeed, the evidence shows that he was in the town of Sundance at the same time as the Sundance Kid. Here we see Sundance with his girlfriend Ethel or Etta Place. So these two men may well have met when Sundance was young and in prison. The Curry brothers worked in Montana for local ranchers and on their own spread with their friend Jim Thornhill. But things began to go wrong when they fell out with Powell Pike Landusky, the patriarch of the town of Landusky that bore his name. The reasons for the feud are a little unclear, but they seem to have involved the fact that Lonnie was paying, how shall we say, a little too much attention to Pike's stepdaughter Effie Desiree, the consequence of which was at least one child. And it also involves assertions that Landusky brought charges against the Logan brothers for theft, and because there was no prison or deputy sheriff in Landusky, Pike was appointed and held some of the Logan brothers in his barn, where he beat them. Not surprisingly, they weren't over impressed by that. Matters came to a head on December the 27th, 1894. By that time, Hank Logan had died, and that seems to have removed from the remaining Logan brothers the last stabilising influence in their lives. After this, they all go off the rails. Anyway, the Logans and Thornhill go to Jake Harris's saloon in Landusky. Here they find Pike Landusky having a drink. Now, Harvey Logan deliberately picked a fight with Pike while the others covered the drinkers around the bar. Harvey pounded Pike until he gave up. Pike wasn't helped by the fact he was wearing a big bearskin coat which hampered his movement. But anyway, Pike indicates he's going to give up, but then he pulled a gun. The problem Pike had was that the gun was a modern automatic, and he struggled to make the mechanism work. While Pike is fumbling with the pistol, Harvey either grabbed his own gun or it was passed to him, and it being a simple, straightforward 44 Colt Peacemaker, he shot Pike dead. This is the only killing that can clearly and definitely be pinned on Harvey Logan. Instead of staying to face justice, and it's arguable that he might just have got off with the charges given that Pike had pulled the pistol, you never know. But instead of staying, Logan fled south to Wyoming, where he hooked up with a group of outlaws known as the Hole in the Wall Gang. Now, it's important to note this gang didn't include Butch Cassidy. Cassidy did spend a little time in the Buffalo area of Wyoming, but Cassidy was in prison at this time, serving 2 years for horse theft, having been jailed in 1894. But the gang did include Flatnose George Curry and just possibly the young Sundance Kid. Sundance had robbed a train at Malta, Montana in 1892, then fled to Canada, and then drifted back into Wyoming. He's usually known to have been on the Snake River in southern Wyoming around this time, but it's possible that he, Kid Curry and Flatnose George knew each other around this time. Exactly what Kid Curry was up to for the next couple of years is unclear, as is often the case in the history of outlaws. What is known is that he lost another brother. On the 1st of February 1896, Johnny Logan was shot dead by rancher Jim Winters. Winters and Johnny Logan had been in dispute about the ranch occupied by Jim Winters. Johnny Logan turned up and pulled a pistol. Winters pulled a shotgun, and shotgun beats pistol. Kid Curry reappeared in 1897. In April of that year, the authorities in Johnson County, Wyoming, scene of the former Range War from 1892, hired a special deputy. They brought in a man called William Billy Dean, about whom little is known, to help them deal with the outlaw problem. What is known is that Dean confronted the outlaws at the Griggs post office, which was in a ranch not far from the hole in the wall. On 13th of April 1897, Dean rode up to the ranch, brandishing his Winchester, and opened fire. The outlaws fought back and Dean was shot dead. Whether Logan was one of the killers is unclear, but the killing is often credited to his account without any more evidence than that. A little while later, 28th of June 1897, probably the same gang of outlaws, and probably including Logan and Flatnose George, robbed the bank in Belle Fourche, South Dakota, not far from the eastern Wyoming line. But the robbery was a fiasco. The outlaws sent one of their own, a man named Tom O'Day, into town to scout out the bank. But Tom was more interested in getting drunk in Sebastian's saloon than in scouting out the bank. After a while, the remaining outlaws rode in to rob the bank, given that there was no sign of Tom O'Day. O'Day tried to hide himself in an outhouse and dumped his gun belt and pistol into the mire before he was captured. He must have smelt wonderful, a combination of whatever from the outhouse and several pints of whiskey. Anyway, he was carted off to the local prison. The remaining outlaws fled. 3 of them, Kid Curry, the Sundance Kid, and a cowboy called Walt Puntney, who until this point had had a reputation as a straight cowboy from the Bighorn Basin, were later captured. They were overhauled on the Musselshell River, Montana, near the little town of Lavina, on the 22nd of September 1897 by a posse led by Sheriff John Dunn of Carbon County. The 3 men had been hanging around his town, Red Lodge, Montana, and it was assumed that they were casing the bank. There was a brief gunfight in which Harvey Logan was shot across the wrist before the 3 men were all arrested and taken back to South Dakota. They were jailed in Deadwood, South Dakota, because the prison in Belle Fourche was non-existent. The prison in Deadwood didn't hold up much better either. On the 31st of October, the outlaws broke out, along with Tom O'Day, who by this time had recovered from whatever stinking hangover he had. O'Day and Puntney were promptly recaptured. They stood trial and somehow were acquitted of the robbery. Logan vanished. He may have met up with Butch Cassidy and his buddy Elsie Lay, who by this time were hiding out at the WS Ranch near Alma, New Mexico. Then there was a series of train robberies that proved to be the high point of the outlaws, who came to be called the Wild Bunch. But they were disastrous for the outlaws and, sadly, for local lawmen. The Union Pacific was attacked near Wilcox, Wyoming on the 2nd of June 1899. The express car was blown open and currency rained down from the skies, but currency with the corners burnt off. Then the Colorado and Southern was attacked near Folsom, New Mexico on the 11th of July 1899. And a year later, the Union Pacific was attacked again near Tipton, Wyoming on the 29th of August 1900. Now, in the aftermath of the Wilcox robbery, Sheriff Joe Hazen was shot dead by the fleeing train robbers. And in the aftermath of the Colorado and Southern train robbery, New Mexico lawman Sheriff Farr was killed in a gunfight at Turkey Canyon. In both cases, the killings were attributed to Logan, even though it's unlikely he took part in the Folsom robbery and the killer was probably Will Carver or another man. Now, he may have taken part in the Wyoming robberies, along with Flatnose George, but again, the evidence that he was the killer is weak. But time was running out now for the friends of Harvey Logan. The money taken from the Wilcox robbery was easily identifiable. and the banks and the railroads, particularly the Union Pacific, had brought in the Pinkertons to run down the outlaws. Lonnie Logan, after some adventures in Montana, was traced back to his aunt's house in Dodson, Missouri. A Pinkerton posse joined by local lawmen, or rather a local posse with a couple of Pinkertons, surrounded the house, and Lonnie made a run for it. Now again, in some of the early and popular histories, you'll find descriptions of a vicious gunfight in which Lonnie Logan emerges from the snow brandishing pistols in both hands and charges the posse before he's almost cut in half by rifle fire. The reality was a little more banal. He fled out of the side door of the house. He did draw a pistol but didn't fire a shot. One round from the posse hit him in the back of the head and he was killed instantly. He died in a snow-covered cornfield that's now a lot that sells barbecue equipment. In Arizona, however, there was an ongoing outbreak of outlawry. Two posse men, Gus Gibbons and Frank Lasser, were chasing outlaws in March 1900 when the two men were shot dead on the 27th of March. 2 days later, 29th of March 1900, Deputy United States Marshal George Scarborough was shot from ambush. Again, the killers were assumed to have included Harvey Logan. Then another outlaw went down. Flatnose George was killed in a fight with Utah lawmen on the 17th of April 1900. And when two of the lawmen, Tyler and Jenkins, who chased Flatnose George, were themselves killed on the 26th of May 1900, once again it was assumed that Logan was one of the killers. Most of these assertions that Logan was involved in all these killings came from the notion that a real outlaw named Tom Capehart was Harvey Logan. In fact, Tom Capehart and Harvey Logan were separate and distinct individuals. But Logan's rap sheet was filling up rapidly, whether or not he was responsible for all the entries. Logan may have been involved in the bank robbery in Winnemucca, Nevada on the 19th of September 1900, although that's usually put down to Will Carver, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Whoever was involved, 5 of the outlaws gathered in Fort Worth in November to have their photograph taken, the famous Fort Worth 5 picture. But now the outlaws were dying off at an alarming rate. Will Carver was killed in Sonora, Texas, on the 2nd of April 1901. Logan was nearby with a brother of Ben Kilpatrick and Ben Kilpatrick himself. But Logan fled after Will Carver was shot down. But Logan wasn't done yet. On 3rd of July 1901, Logan and other men robbed the Northern Pacific at Exeter Switch, just west of Malta, Montana. This was the same place that Sundance had robbed a train back in 1892. Now, Butch and Sundance weren't at the Malta robbery in 1901. There's plenty of evidence that indicates they'd left the country in the spring of that year and were in the foothills of the Andes at the time, establishing a new ranch for themselves. In the aftermath of the Great Northern robbery, Jim Winters, the man who'd shot down Johnny Logan, was killed. He was shot from ambush outside his ranch house on the 25th of July 1901. Again, Logan is given the credit for this killing, and he certainly had a motive for doing so, but in the absence of eyewitness evidence or any other evidence, it can only be an assumption. In the aftermath of the Great Northern robbery at Exeter Switch, Logan went on holiday. He travelled through the Midwest in the company of prostitute Annie Rogers, the woman seen in this photograph with him. And it was Annie's attempt to change some of the Great Northern money in a bank in Nashville that led to her arrest and Logan fleeing once again. Logan was finally caught in December of 1901. He was hiding out in Knoxville, Tennessee, and not doing a very good job of it. He was in a bar, Ike Jones Bar in Knoxville, when he got into a fight with 2 men who were trying to cheat him at pool. He was beating 7 shades of whatever out of then when 2 local policemen intervened, Officers Saylor and Dinwiddie. Logan pulled a pistol and shot both men, even as they bludgeoned him over the head with their nightsticks. Logan kicked open the back door of the saloon and fell well over a dozen feet into the creek behind the saloon, but he escaped, at least for a day or two. He was finally captured, rain-soaked, frozen and bloodied, and hauled back to face trial. On the 29th of November 1902, Kid Curry was sentenced to 130 years in prison to be served with hard labour. Ironically, he wasn't sentenced for train robbery, even though the evidence was overwhelming that he'd been at the Exeter Switch robbery and almost certainly at the Wilcox robbery. He was convicted for forging signatures on the stolen banknotes. Convicting him of the train robbery charge was just too difficult, but the forgery charge was easier to make stick, and it did. Inevitably, his attorneys appealed the conviction, and the Pinkertons strongly advised that Logan should be held in a federal penitentiary. While the appeal process went ahead, they argued he was just too dangerous an outlaw to be kept in the jail in Knoxville. On the 23rd of June 1903, the Pinkertons' predictions came to fruition. Logan broke out of prison and fled to the west. He's sometimes thought to have been the man who was shot in the leg in a long-range exchange of gunfire with lawmen in May 1904 on Bridger Creek in Wyoming. But that man was probably another small-time outlaw named John Kosh, who was wanted for the murder of a sheep herder named Vedder some years earlier. Personally, I believe the end came for Harvey Logan, Kid Curry, on the 9th of June 1904. On the 7th of June, 3 men held up the Denver and Rio Grande, just west of Parachute, Colorado. The 3 men fled eastwards, disconcerted because they'd attacked the wrong train. They'd attempted, or they wanted to hit the Colorado Midland, which ran on the same line, but the local train in the Colorado Midland had swapped places to allow the Midland to keep up to its timetable, and it had gone through the station at Parachute about 10 minutes before the local train that the outlaws boarded and then attacked. The 3 men made slow progress through the hills and were doggedly pursued by local ranchers and lawmen. The outlaws seemed to have thought that they could make progress by stealing horses from local ranchers rather than by leaving relays of horses across their escape route, as was the previous practice of outlaws like Curry and Butch Cassidy. On the morning of the 9th of June 1904, the outlaws confronted their pursuers near the Larson Ranch on Divide Creek and ordered them to turn back. The posse men did indeed turn back, but they didn't go very far. The outlaws abandoned their horses and scrambled up a scree onto Gibson's Flats, and as they did that, the local ranchers, or at least a part of them, realised that they could get round behind the ranchers if they went up Gibson's Gulch to the north of the flats, which would then bring them out onto the flats in front of the escaping outlaws. And that's just what happened. As the 3 outlaws made their way across the flats, heading north, back towards the Grand River, the ranchers emerged from Gibson's Gulch. One of the outlaws opened fire, almost certainly Kid Curry, bringing down at least one of the ranchers' horses and scattering the posse men. One of the ranchers, Elmer Chapman, scrambled to his feet and made a run back towards the cover of the brush around the gulch. As he did so, the outlaw drew a bead on Chapman and began to track him. As Chapman ran, another rancher, his friend Roller Gardner, drew a bead on the outlaw and fired. His Winchester bullet ripped across the outlaw's bicep, ripping it open, smashed his chest and tore out through the other arm, knocking the outlaw back behind some rocks. The outlaw was, if not mortally wounded, he was in danger of bleeding out at some point, and he now couldn't use anything but a pistol. The other train robbers called out to the fallen outlaw to ask how he was. He replied that he was all done in and going to end it. Then the outlaw shot himself in the head with his pistol. The other 2 men escaped to the north, back into Wyoming, and were never definitely identified. There was a lengthy debate about the identity of the dead man. He was identified initially as a minor outlaw called Kid Brannick, but Brannick turned out to have been in jail at the time of the robbery. Then he was identified as an Arizona bad man called Tap Duncan, But Tap Duncan turned up alive and well in Arizona, at least until he was hit by a truck in 1944. Many people identified the dead outlaw as Harvey Logan, Kid Curry. Some disagreed, and you'll still get a debate about it to this day. But none of the post-1904 sightings of Harvey Logan stand up to scrutiny. For example, he was alleged to have been involved in the bank robbery in Cody, Wyoming, later in 1904. But none of the descriptions of those robbers match Logan. There are stories of him turning up in South America and joining up with Butch and Sundance at their ranch in Cholula. But those stories turn out to be stories of a minor Montana outlaw named Andrew Duffy, who died in South America, probably at the hands of fellow outlaws. The Pinkerton brothers, who'd been chasing Logan for some years now, and the head of the Union Pacific Police, Bill Canada, were wary about declaring the dead man definitively as Harvey Logan. The Pinkertons had built up Kid Curry as a nemesis of the Union Pacific and as the leader of what they were now calling the Wild Bunch, a term they'd coined in 1902. And in fact, they had given him a reputation, along with Flatnose George, as, how should I put it, as premier train robbers, far above any reputation that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid for train robbery. The problem they then had was, if they declared Harvey Logan dead, Kid Curry dead, then they risked the possibility that if he then turned up alive, their credibility was blown. Equally, if they declared him dead and the last of the great train robbers gone, then the banks and the railroads might think again about whether they needed to employ the Pinkertons. In fact, the Union Pacific continued to employ the Pinkertons until 1909. So the Union Pacific, through Bill Canada, and the Pinkertons, through William and Robert Pinkerton, were wary of agreeing that the fallen outlaw was indeed Harvey Logan. But I put my faith in Lowell Spence. Lowell Spence was the Pinkerton agent who chased Kid Curry for months in the aftermath of the train robberies. He had sat through Logan's trials in Tennessee and seen the man in prison in that state. If anyone knew Harvey Logan by sight, it was going to be Lowell Spence. In addition, the Pinkertons, through Spence, arranged for the photographs of the dead outlaw to be shown to the authorities in Tennessee. They identified the photographs as Harvey Logan, the man they'd had in their custody for well over a year. Again, if they were wrong and Logan reappeared, they would look stupid, and they had enough problems at the time in the aftermath of Logan's escape. So in my opinion, it was Harvey Logan who died on that lonely flat above Gibson's Gulch on the 9th of June 1904. He's certainly dead now. So we are left with Harvey Kid Curry Logan, an outlaw whose reputation certainly exceeded his deeds, but who was a practiced outlaw, bank and train robber, and a killer, certainly, who would not shy away from using his guns when cornered or when he felt that vengeance was warranted. Kid Curry might not have been as bad as he's sometimes been portrayed, but he was certainly bad enough.